Hello, beautiful people. This is Venerable Tikwang Tree, and you're listening to Dharma on Demand on Dharma Tree. So today we are going to continue our discussion on the Eightfold Path, and we are on the second path, right thinking or right intention, known in Sanskrit as Samyak Samkalpa. So, right thinking or intention refers to the volitional aspect of the path. So, it's the mental energy to control our speech and actions. So, this is the commitment to ethical and mental self improvement by ridding ourselves of whatever qualities we know to be wrong and immoral. So, if we train ourselves in right thinking, then our right view will also improve. And then the Buddha explained that right intention is threefold. So there's the intention of renunciation, the intention of goodwill, and the intention of harmlessness. So the three are opposed to the three parallel kinds of wrong intention: the intention governed by desire, intention governed by ill will, and the intention governed by harmlessness. So, right intention is second on the path because, or between a right view and right speech, because the mind is intentional function forms the crucial link connecting our cognitive perspective with our modes of active engagement in the world. So, on the one side, action always points back to the thoughts from which they spring, but thought is the forerunner of action, right? So it directs the mind and body, stirring them into activity, using them as instruments for expressing its aims and ideals and ideas. So these aims and ideals, our intentions, in turn point back a further step to the prevailing views. So when wrong views prevail, the outcome is wrong intention, which gives rise to unwholesome actions. So, thus one who denies the moral efficacy of action and measures achievement in terms of gain and status will aspire to nothing but gain and status, right? Using whatever means we can come to acquire them. So when such pursuits become widespread, the result is suffering. And the cause for the endless competition, conflict, injustice, and oppression does not lie outside of our mind. So these are all just manifestations of intentions. They are outcroppings of thoughts driven by greed, anger, and ignorance, the three poisons. But when the intentions are right, the actions will be right. And for the intentions to be right, the surest guarantee is right view. And the Buddha sums up this matter when he says that for a person who holds a wrong view, his deeds, words, plans, and purposes grounded in that view will lead to suffering. While a person who holds a right view, his deeds, words, plans, and purposes grounded in that view will lead to happiness. So, since greed and aversion are deeply grounded, they do not yield easily. However, the work of overcoming them is not impossible if an effective strategy is employed, right? So, the path devised by the Buddha makes use of an indirect approach. It proceeds by tackling the thoughts of which or to which these defilements give rise. So greed and aversion surface in the form of thoughts and thus can be eroded by a process of a thought substitution, right? By replacing them with the thoughts opposed to them. The intention of renunciation provides the remedy to greed, and then greed comes to manifestation in thoughts of desire as essential, acquisitive, and possessive thoughts. But thoughts of renunciation spring from the wholesome root of non greed, which they activate whenever they are cultivated. So, since contrary thoughts cannot coexist, when thoughts of renunciation are aroused, they dislodge the thoughts of desire. They are then causing non-greed to replace greed. And similarly, the intentions of goodwill and harmlessness offer the antidote to aversion, And thoughts of goodwill counter ill will, and thoughts of harmlessness will counter harming. So, in this way, removing the unwholesome roots of aversion itself. So, now we get to the first aspect of the intention of renunciation. And the Buddha gives a message that the pull of desire is to be resisted and eventually abandoned. So desire is to be abandoned not because it's morally evil, but because it's the root of suffering, right? This is given in the second noble truth, that the cause of suffering is desire. So thus renunciation, turning away from craving and its desire or its drive for gratification, becomes the key to happiness, right? To free the freedom from the hold of attachment. This does not mean that everyone has to leave the household life and join the monastery, right? You don't have to become a nun or monk or nun to do that. But the degree to which a person renounces depends on his or her disposition and situation, of course. But what remains as a guiding principle in this is that the attainment of deliverance requires the complete eradication of craving, and progress along the path is accelerated to the extent that one overcomes craving. So breaking free from domination by desire may not be easy, but the difficulty does not abrogate the necessity, right? So since craving is the origin of suffering, origin of dukkha, putting an end to dukkha depends on eliminating craving, and that involves directing the mind to renunciation. So the tool that the Buddha holds out to free the mind from desire is understanding. Real renunciation is not a matter of compelling ourselves to give up things still inwardly cherished, but of changing our perspective on them so that they no longer bind us. So when we understand the nature of desire, when we investigate it closely with keen attention, the desire falls away by itself without the need for struggle. So, to understand desire in such a way that we can loosen its hold, we need to see that desire is always bound up with suffering, with dukkha. So, the whole phenomena of desire, with its cycle of wanting and gratification, hangs on our way of seeing things, right? Because we remain in the bondage of desire because we see it as our means to happiness. But if we can look at desire from a different angle, its force will be defeated, resulting in the move toward renunciation. And then we come to the second aspect, the intention of goodwill. The intention of goodwill opposes the intention of ill will, right? The thoughts governed by anger and aversion. And there are two ineffective ways of handling ill will. So one is to yield to it, to express the aversion by bodily or verbal action. This approach releases the tension, helps drive the anger out of one's system, quote unquote, but it also poses certain dangers because it breeds resentment and provokes retaliation. It creates enemies, it poisons our relationships or ruins our relationships, and it generates unwholesome karma. So, in the end, the ill will does not actually leave our system after all, right? But instead, it's driven out to a deeper level where it just continues to impair our thoughts and conduct. So, the other approach is repression, also, which also fails to dispel the destructive force of ill will, because it merely turns that force around and pushes it inward, where it just becomes transformed into some type of self-contempt, of chronic depression, or a tendency for irrational outbursts of violence, for instance, right? So the remedy that the Buddha recommends to counter ill will, especially the object, especially if the object is another person, is a quality called metta, or loving kindness, right? The intense feeling of selfless love for other beings, which radiates outward as a heartfelt concern for their well-being and their happiness. So it must come from a deep inner feeling characterized by spontaneous warmth rather than just by a sense of obligation, right? We use and develop metta bhavana or loving kindness meditation to develop good will. And we can read and practice loving kindness metta meditation from different sources. But the general idea of loving kindness meditation is to develop and concentrate and meditate on the goodwill and happiness and safety of ourselves, and then extend that same feeling to our loved ones, to our coworkers, people we may just casually know, our acquaintances, to strangers, and then finally to our enemies, or those that we dislike, and to all sentient beings. And then we come to the third aspect, the last aspect, which is the intention of harmlessness. So the intention of harmlessness is thought that's guided by compassion or karuna, that's aroused in opposition to cruel, aggressive, and violent thoughts. So again, we go back to loving kindness here. And loving kindness has the characteristic of wishing for the happiness and welfare of others, because compassion has this characteristic of wishing that others be free from suffering. I wish to be extended without limits to all living beings. And like metta, or loving kindness, compassion arises by entering into the subjectivity of others, by sharing their interiority in a deep and total way, right? So it springs up by considering that all beings, like ourselves, wish to be free from suffering and wish to be happy. So to develop compassion as a meditative exercise, it's most effective to start with somebody who is actually undergoing suffering, right? Since this provides the natural object for compassion, one contemplates this person's suffering either directly or imaginatively, then reflect that oneself, or if he or she also wants to be free from suffering, and the thought should be repeated and contemplation continually exercised until a strong feeling of compassion swells up in the heart. Then, using that feeling as a standard, one turns to different individuals, considering how they are each, exposed to suffering, and radiate that gentle feeling of compassion out to them. So to increase the breadth and intensity of compassion, it's also helpful to contemplate the various sufferings to which living beings are subjected to, or susceptible to. And a useful guideline to this extension is provided by the First Noble Truth, with its enumeration of the different aspects of dukkha or suffering. So one contemplates beings as subject to old age, sickness, death, sorrow, pain, despair, etc. So when a high level of success has been achieved in generating compassion for the contemplation, or by the contemplation of beings who are directly afflicted by suffering, we can then move on to consider people who are presently enjoying happiness, which they have acquired by immoral means, for example. So we might reflect that such people, despite their superficial fortune and happiness, are also, or without a doubt, troubled deep within by the pains of consciousness. So even if they display no outward signs of inner distress or suffering, one knows that they will eventually reap the bitter fruits of their evil deeds, which will bring them intense suffering. So then finally, one can widen the scope of one's contemplation to include all living beings. And there is a quote here that by letting go is letting go of what you don't have. And of course, sure, we have the thoughts about it in our mind, but thoughts of the fabrications of the mind and don't represent the world around us. They're just illusions, fantasies, and calculations, right? Because happiness is technically relative. Because our happiness or the happiness for most people, it comes in the form of possessions or money or status or reputation, but all these things are ultimately impermanent, right? We may have money for a long time, we may have our status and our position in society and all this other stuff that kind of gives us this high ground um, happiness, but eventually all that just has to end, right? We can't have our same status forever, whether it's, in politics or in a company, right? Eventually we do have to, um, we may retire or quit or get fired or something, right? And so we lose that when that happens. And the sooner we're able to recognize that all these external factors and ideals and ideas and perceptions are impermanent, the sooner we're able to face the reality of life, that these externalities do not bring ultimate happiness. They bring temporary happiness. Because if we think about it, if we think about, let's say we got a new phone or a new car, right? It's fresh, it's fancy, it's new, it's shiny, and we take care of it like nothing else, for a few weeks, maybe a few months, but eventually it just becomes another thing that you have. You stop looking at it as this new shiny thing, and start to look at it as just something else that you just own, that you have to use, that you have to drive or use or look into or play or whatever it may be, right? Eventually, that initial happiness and excitement that it brought to us will no longer be there. And so, if we are able to recognize that that same feeling is in everything else that we have and own or want, then it's easier for us to not be so hung up on wanting those things so badly. It'll be easier for us to understand and accept that these externalities will not bring ultimate happiness, right? They will bring temporary happiness, but that's exactly what it is. It's just temporary. It's not forever. And the only forever happiness that we can achieve is by practicing the Eightfold Path and knowing that these external ideas and statuses and money and whatever may be are not the real happiness. The real happiness is freedom of our mind, freedom in our mind, freedom from suffering, and freedom from the three poisons of ignorance, greed, and anger. And that concludes our second of the Eightfold Path. So I hope you enjoyed this. Again, if there's ever any questions or concerns or emotional outbursts, feel free to leave me a comment or send me a message or an email, and I will try to respond to your question. Thank you for joining me here today. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha.